lower taxes, but some did really not. The Hindus were not very well treated at all, really, by the Mughal Empire. They had really a rough life, but even Sikhism, they rose as a result of the Mughal Empire's prosecution. Akbar came to power after that, and he was a Mughal ruler who created his own religion, divine faith. He believed in tolerance and hated the jizya. He abolished the jizya. Pretty much everyone had an equal shot under his reign, so that really created peace. He was a very fair ruler. He had kind of a progressive, graduated income tax, something that we see in the United States today, which took it easier on the poor people who couldn't really contribute much. And because of the fairness of the tax, way more people decided to actually pay it. And that really helped things and brought in some money for the empire. He was able to unite a group of over 100 million people, which was at the time more than all of Europe put together, which was pretty impressive. Shah Jahan was the last great Mughal empire after Akbar. The empire after that, Aurangzeb, could be to blame for the decline of the Mughal empire because of his tolerance. He brought back the jizya, which was the tax on the Hindus and all non-Muslim foreigners, and that caused some real unrest in the country, and that did freak some things out about it. But the problem again with Shah Jahan was he kind of sheltered the wealth to himself. He was building gardens, monuments, forts while his country was suffering. There was some famine going on. Farmers needed tools, roads, and ways of irrigating their crops and dealing with India's harsh environment. And then Aurangzeb, as we mentioned, came to power. He moved first and decisively. In a bitter civil war, he executed his older brother, who was his most serious rival for the throne, and then he kind of moved to create the strong religious intolerance that we again began to sow there in the region. So the people really did begin to suffer there. He was a master of military strategy and aggressive empire builder. He ruled from 1658 to 1707. He expanded the Mughal holdings to their greatest size, but the power of the empire weakened during his reign. This loss of power was largely due to his oppression of his people. His rigidly enforced Islamic laws outlawed drinking, gambling, and other activities viewed as vices. He appointed censors to police his subjects' morals and made sure they prayed at the appointed time. So he was spying on a lot of his people. He was pretty much the polar opposite of everything his successor Akbar was. He was not very tolerant. He was very closed-minded, and he was just not a good guy. Really wasn't. He was very intolerant over the religions. He was very oppressive, and that just was not good for the future. There was a civil war that broke out to lead to his power, and then he made the real bad decision. Was he started trading with the British East India Company over Portugal, and that was not the best because the British East India Company did lead to the decline of the Mughal Empire. So now we turn over to our next empire, which was the Qing Dynasty of China. Very exciting stuff. So what was up with them? Well, they were founded by the Manchus, who were a group of people from northern China who defeated the Ming and formed the Qing Dynasty. It was the last great imperial dynasty of China. Emperor Qinglong was effective and hardworking and brought the Qing China to the largest and most prosperous point. They upheld existing Confucian values and social systems, guaranteed security on the nation's borders, and brought China to an age of unprecedented prosperity. And I mean, honestly, life under the Qing Dynasty was really, really nice. Just to describe it pretty quickly, the Chinese probably enjoyed a higher standing of living than any other people on Earth. The Qing Dynasty was founded, as you know, by the group of people called the Manchus from northern China. They continued this splendor. 18th century Chinese scholars refer to the period as when all aspects of culture flourished. China was a prosperous state with abundant natural resources, a huge but basically happy population, and a royal house of great prestige at home and abroad. That's how that was kind of described. Government, though, was a little bit slow and kind of unable to just respond to crises, but more or less things were quite fine. The Dutch tried to come in and trade with them, and things didn't really work out well for anyone who wanted to trade with the Qing Dynasty because they were like, what do you have to offer us that we don't really, what do you have to offer us that we really need here? We're all right. We are very much good here in the Qing Dynasty. So yeah, they were very confident and feeling very nice. While they eventually did get in a little bit of a trade, a kind of a little bit of a mix-up with the Eastern India Trading Company after they originally rejected, the Chinese originally rejected the East India Trading Company, you'll see what happened there. That only happens much later in the unit and will not be on the final exam. Much later in the time period and will not be in the final exam. So we're going to move on. We're going to move on to Japan and the Tokugawa shogunate. Just kidding. I know it's the Tokugawa shogunate. I know it, but whatever. It's time now to move on to learn maybe just a little bit about this Tokugawa shogunate. And we're going to do it. And believe me. All right, so this is what we will know. They ruled a unified Japan for 250 years. They traded with Europe at first, but once they began to convert Japanese people to Christianity, Japan launched the Act of Seclusion, which means pretty much no more trading with foreign influences. They were a danger to the survival of Japan and the shogunate, which, for those of you who don't know, just a quick take a pause for a sec. Remember where we were, get a pause, and just so you know, shogunate has a simple structure where the emperor is at the top, but he's kind of a figurehead. He has no real power. Who do have the power is the shogun. They're supposed to be supposedly regents for the emperor, but they had a lot of the power. The daimyo, where their assistants, the samurai, were the big warriors that experienced kind of a drop in power in the Tokugawa shogunate because it was a very peaceful time, so they didn't really need to fight that much. And then, of course, there were the peasants, which, I mean, it's pretty obvious. Those were the peasants. So that's what the shogunate structure is that we all know and love today. So now we go back to this act of exclusion. The act of seclusion was a Japanese decree intended to eliminate all foreign influence enforced by strict government rules and regulations to impose those ideas. So it was the third of a series imposed by the shogun, the Tokugawa shogun, from the series of 1623 to 1651. So they really want to hammer it down. It was the no foreign influence, no trading whatsoever, mainly because of the corrosive influence on the Japanese culture. At least what they believed was a corrosive influence. The Japanese government believed was a corrosive influence on Japanese culture by the Europeans. So the Europeans, they weren't the biggest fans of that. And besides, it wasn't a really big deal for Japan, though, because they kind of valued agriculture a little bit more than trade. The daimyo, they held the power, but they were closely watched by the emperor in the shogunate as this whole situation was going down. The daimyo were wealthy landowners, and they were around the same level, if not a little bit below, the position of the shogunate. So, yeah, and then, of course, there were the peasants, artisans, merchants, and in between those two were the samurai, Japan's warriors, as I explained. Anyway, so that's kind of what went on with the Tokugawa shogunate. So yeah, that's what went on in Unit 8. So now we turn to Unit 9. These are it's all about power struggles in Europe. We're going to take a look at some of the big absolute monarchs of the day there, and we start with Spain and King Philip. He was one of the first absolute monarchs we talked about in Unit 9. He was a pretty big deal, and the thing with him, we will talk a little bit more about him right now. He had the divine right to rule over all aspects of his country. He was a very religious guy. He believed in huge palaces. He had multiple colonies in South and Central America, even North America to some degree in the West. And he had patrons, which are those are the people who improved and added to society that he supported financially. And here is how things went out for him. As it's now time to kind of take a little bit of a look up about his policies. So here's what he thought. One of his main things was a description of his problems was taxes. He had made a decision to not lower taxes and on the nobles, to not tax the nobles, and it led to heavy taxes on the lower classes. And it was never a good idea, preventing the development of a middle class, and created some massive income inequality, similar to a situation that's kind of developing right now in America. It was Inflation also increased under his reign. It was because of a huge influx of silver from the New World. It brought some wealth to some, but also caused some massive inflation in the value, as the value of money in Spain did decrease. There was also a big trade deficit in Spain. They focused on only the importation of silver, so Spain's domestic industries kind of remained stagnant and medieval. Guilds continued to control manufacturing. Guilds or unions where pretty much all the workers team up to have the most leverage to fight for fair conditions over their bosses. They continued to control all manufacturing, and with their de facto monopoly on goods, they also kept their prices high. So without competition, they also kind of stuck to the old inefficient methods, because sometimes competition can be a good thing to push innovation forward. So that's a good thing as well. Philip had some pretty rough time with colonial policy. This was this kind of all centered around the Dutch revolt that he had to deal with. This was a turn of the tide in the power of the Spanish Empire, and a big victory for the Protestants, as initially gold and silver flowed from the conquered Aztec and Incan society. This easy money enabled Philip to maintain and equip his armies needed to run his vast empire, fund merchant ships for commerce, and build a large and amazing navy. With this money and ambition, he was able to initially crush most of the revolt. So things pretty much stayed good for him. But he was not done getting hammered yet. He still had some more problems to deal with. And one of those was his many wars. He had wars in 4 major locations, including Spain, Portugal, the New World, and the Ottoman Empire, which was not the best for him at all. Philip wanted to rid Europe of Protestantism and return it back to a purely Catholic continent. He did wage a series of religious wars, and one of the largest was against his former sister-in-law, Elizabeth of England. We'll get to her in a moment. But by the end of the 1580s, Philip II saw England's Queen Elizabeth I as his chief Protestant enemy. She also supported the Dutch against Spain and encouraged English captains to plunder the Spanish ships and loot Spanish cities in the Americas. So, yeah, the Spain-British rivalry was really kind of festering for quite a long time. Philip II prepared a huge armada, or fleet of warships, to invade England, but the lighter, faster English ships defeated the Spanish armada in the English Channel, and that kind of represented the beginning of the end for those two. For the Spanish Empire and the Spanish center of dominance, they really were kind of knocked out. So pretty much what happened in the religious side of things in Spain was not very pretty. It was the Inquisition. He was a staunch defender of the Catholic Church, Philip was, and he believed that God had chosen the Spanish people to save Catholicism from Protestant heretics. He continued the Inquisition, which is pretty much exterminating. Yeah, that's exactly what it sounds like, including pretty much all Protestants, including the expulsion of Jews as well, 2 groups with many trade skills, education, and money. So that's not a great idea if you want to have a successful country. One of the long-term consequences of his striving to enforce Catholicism through the Inquisition was the gradual smothering of Spain's intellectual life. Students were barred for studying elsewhere, and books printed by Spaniards outside the kingdom were banned. Such strict enforcement of Orthodox belief came at a heavy price in the long run, as her great academic institutions were reduced to third-rate status under Philip's successors. So when I say her, I'm talking about Spain here. So that's pretty much where things worked. So Muslims, Jews, they were all being kicked out of Spain in pretty massive numbers. They did have some good art, though, but that, again, was a little bit smothered by their religion. So, the greatest writer in Spanish history, just a little side note, Miguel de Cervantes wrote what is considered to be the world's first modern novel, Don Quixote, during this time, which is classic in Western literature about a crazy knight crazy guy who thinks he's a knight and something to do with a windmill. I haven't read it. Don't blame me. But just what you gotta know is Don Quixote, Miguel de Cervantes, came from Spain. All right, so now we turn our attention to the next big absolute monarch on our plate, and we're going to talk about that, and we're going to maybe move a little bit quickly now down the road, and that is, ladies and gentlemen, our next absolute monarch, Elizabeth I of England. she was kind of a boss. She in a way she was one of the only real female rulers of her time in Europe.